Welcome everyone to the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. Thank you for attending and I hope you're having a great conference. I'd like to introduce Maarten, who will be presenting a session titled Microsoft Teams Architecture Deep Dive. Take it away, Maarten.
Thanks very much, John. All right, welcome everybody. I guess good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the globe. We're joining this awesome conference, and it's my turn now to do a session about Microsoft Teams. First, a couple of slides that I'm sure you've seen before, but I really like to share them, really important slides. The SharePoint conference in Las Vegas is renamed. It's now called the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. And the dates have been set as well for 2021, so put that in your agenda. And of course, thanks to all the generous sponsors, they make this event possible. So make sure you check out their websites and subscribe to their email newsletters. And thanks to them for making this event possible. All right, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Maarten Eekels. I'm from the Netherlands, where I live in the south near the Belgian border. I'm the Chief Digital Officer at Portiva, and Portiva is a company in the Netherlands, and we basically do Microsoft Cloud with about 100 people. And I am a Microsoft MVP and a Microsoft Regional Director. That's it for me. I did put my Twitter handle in the introduction slide, and I put it here as well. So if you have any questions after this session, please do reach out on Twitter, or you can find me through my blog or etc. And I will make sure to answer your questions. All right, only 15 minutes, so let's get right into the content. I'd like to start with the Microsoft Teams logical architecture before we dive into the more second layer of architecture. And if we look from the logical side of things, we start with you. You're the user and you're using Microsoft Teams. And as you all know, you use Teams both from a chat perspective and from a channel perspective. So within chats, you have one-on-one conversations or even one-on-many conversations. And if you go to channels, then you have your conversations right inside Microsoft Teams in the different teams that exist within your Teams environment. Now, if you have a look at chat, when you share files within your chat, you will see that these files are stored in your OneDrive for Business. So if you share files with other people in your chat, then those files are stored in your OneDrive for Business and only in the OneDrive for Business of the person sharing that particular file. So even if you're chatting with other people, those people will not have that file in their OneDrive for Business, but it will stay in your OneDrive, and there it will reside in a specific folder called Microsoft Chat Teams files, where all the files that you share in the different chats are located. But the interesting thing is that Microsoft sets the permissions for each file as soon as you share them through a chat. So all the files are in that folder, but you are the only one who can see all the files in that folder, because obviously you have the permissions to all these files in there. But anyone else can only see the files that you have shared with them in a chat, because then they will get permissions to that file. So that's how that is set up. What I like about chat is that you can use tabs and apps inside chats as well. And a nice little hidden gem that not many people know is that you can even name chats. So of course we can name teams and channels, but a chat, you can name a chat as well. If you invite multiple people to a chat, there's this little arrow on top of the chat, and when you click it, you will get a drop down, and there you can name the chat. And you can even have multiple chats with the same group of people with different titles of those chats. So that's very convenient if you want to keep track of the conversations that you have with multiple people around certain topics. You can easily scan your chat tab in the Teams client and check the conversations based on the title of the chat. Really convenient. Then, of course, you have the contacts inside Microsoft Teams, and there's messages, and this is an arrow from the chat to the message store, but we will see later on that we also have an arrow from the channel perspective to the conversation store, where messages are stored. And we will talk later about where things are actually stored. But it's good to know, good to realize that messages are stored independently from all the images, emojis, and stickers and everything that are used inside messages. So if you write something in a message and you insert an emoji or you insert a sticker, then this sticker goes into its own storage, into its own blob storage, right into Microsoft Azure. Of course, you can have meetings, you can have calls with people, with your colleagues or with other people outside your organization, and there's voicemail. So when you try to call someone in Teams and that person doesn't answer, you will automatically be forwarded to the voicemail of that person. You can leave a message. And then when you're in a Teams client, you can look up those messages and you can play them right from the Teams client, or you can use the transcript functionality, which unfortunately doesn't work for the Dutch language, but it works pretty well for the English language and a couple of other major languages in the world. So that's where you can see a transcription of your voicemail. Now we will have a look at the other side of things, and that's the Teams side of things within Teams. Sounds interesting, right? The Teams side of things within Teams. When we have a look there, the big difference is that every team has an Office 365 group underneath. And actually, I should change this slide because last week I think Microsoft rebranded this to Microsoft Office, to Microsoft 365 groups. And they're no longer called Office 365 groups, but Microsoft 365 groups now. And that particular group, that takes care of the members and the owners of the team. So in a chat, you have to invite the members yourself, and everybody can keep track of the members and can invite other members. But in a team, only owners can invite other members or approve them. And there you have the construct called members. And you can use, obviously, the Office 365 groups for other services in Office 365 as well. Think of Stream, think of Planner, think of CRM, think of Outlook, of course. So there's and SharePoint. So there's many other services that use the Office 365 groups. Underneath every team, there is a SharePoint site. And in every SharePoint site, there's a document library with folders, and every channel that you create inside your team will automatically create a folder in that SharePoint document library as well. And be careful there, because every member of a team can rename or delete those folders. You wouldn't be the first person who would have a look at the SharePoint side of things, see all the folders there and think, those folders, they don't look very structured to me. I'd like to reorganize my folders a little bit. So you start moving the folders around and maybe put some folders in as a subfolder in another existing folder. And then you go back to Teams, or someone else goes back to Teams and they click the Files tab there, and Teams just checks if there is a folder available for for that channel. If it isn't, it will recreate that folder. But then there are no files in that folder because you just moved that folder as a subfolder to another folder, right? So that's a little bit of maybe a difficult situation, something you need to keep an eye out for, because it does happen. People are used to moving folders around, and if they do that, then they will lose files inside the team, inside the Files tab, and then they will start complaining or yelling, "Hey, where did my files go?" They're still there, but they're somewhere else. And now there's a second SharePoint site with a folder, because now we have private channels as well. And when you create a private channel inside Microsoft Teams, then a separate site collection will be created in SharePoint. And there you will see a folder with the name of that channel. And this is kind of a typical site collection, because that site collection is, first of all, not visible in the SharePoint Admin Center. So that's maybe a little bit inconvenient for the admins out there. And also, it doesn't have all the functionality available that a regular team site has in SharePoint. It has an additional link. When you visit that SharePoint site, you can see that there's a link. When you click it, you move up to the parent SharePoint site collection, logical parent, because physically they're just on the same hierarchy. They're just both site collections, but logically the private folder SharePoint site collection is underneath the original SharePoint site collection. And you can move up, but you cannot move down. So if you're in the top level SharePoint site collection, then you cannot move down to the private folder SharePoint site collection. So you have to go back to Teams and go to the Files tab there to find your files. Like I said, you can't find these site collections, these special site collections in the admin center, but at least Microsoft did give them a specific site ID, as we call it in SharePoint terms. And if you use the SharePoint Online Management Shell in PowerShell, or if you use the PNP PowerShell commandlets, then you can actually search for all the private channel site collections by searching for the team site ID team channel #0. And they're here underneath each other, but they should be next to each other. It's just one word, team channel #0. You can use that. All right, then we move into the more service-oriented architecture. We go a little bit deeper. And we'll talk about the Teams client later on, because I have a separate slide about the Teams client. But here in this slide, you can see all the different services that exist underneath Microsoft Teams. And many of these services already existed before Microsoft Teams was created by Microsoft. So all the purple blocks, the team services and the notification service and the email service, those are new services that were especially created for Microsoft Teams. But the other services are actually already existing services. So the chat and present services, well, those are services that they borrowed from Skype for Business. The same for calling and meeting. The stream recording obviously comes from Stream. Connectors already existed with the Office 365 connectors, which used to be called Outlook connectors. And on the other side, we have the Office applications, we have OneDrive for Business, we have SharePoint, of course, but we also have the most recent used files service. If you go to www.office.com, you will get an overview of all the files that you recently used. You nowadays even have it in Word or PowerPoint. You can see which files you've recently been working on. That service is being used, is being leveraged by Microsoft Teams as well. If you want to upload a file in a channel or in a chat, then you can. You also have the option to have a look at your recent files. And that's the same functionality that was already used in other Office 365 services as well. So Microsoft Teams kind of leverages all these services that already exist. What I like here also is the experimentation feature. And we will talk a little bit more about the Teams client, as I already told you. But the experimentation service basically decides if you get a service enabled or not, because the code base is basically the same for everyone using Microsoft Teams, everyone who's not using some kind of special distributed apps or services by Microsoft, but everybody is using the regular functionality, the regular clients and the regular tenants. Then Microsoft uses the experimentation service to decide if you get a certain feature or not. So where's everything stored? This is a question that I get a lot from customers as well. What you need to realize when we talk about where things are stored and when we talk about Teams architecture is that the conversations are actually stored in two places. So when Microsoft came up with Teams, when they decided about the architecture for Teams, they figured, okay, if we're going to launch a new service within the Office 365 platform, we need to make sure that it offers the compliancy and security features within Office 365 that our other services already offer as well. Think of SharePoint, think of Exchange. So they realized, yeah, we can do two things. We can build everything from scratch and try to tie the existing compliance features like retention, like the audit log, like the e-discovery functionality. We can build new hooks for that, or we can leverage an existing service like Exchange to make sure that this exists when we launch Microsoft Teams. And that's actually what they did. So every time you write a message or every time you insert an image into a message, then that message is stored into Microsoft Teams' own service. And that used to be table storage in Azure, but actually they're moving to Cosmos DB right now. And all the chats already are in Cosmos DB, and all the channel messages, there's currently in progress. Some parts are already in Cosmos DB, not everything yet, but it will soon be there. But from a compliancy perspective, everything is stored in Exchange as well. And this is how it is possible for Office 365 to leverage the e-discovery, audit, DLP engine, etc. Because that looks at the content, those services look at the content in Exchange and not in Cosmos DB. So every time you write a chat message, that chat message is stored in Cosmos DB, but it's also stored in a hidden folder in your own Exchange mailbox in Exchange Online. And every time you write a message in a channel, then that particular message is also stored in the group mailbox for the Office 365 group that is tied to the team where you are writing your message in the channel from that particular team. So files we already talked about. Team files are stored in SharePoint. Chat files are stored in OneDrive for Business. Voicemails are stored in the individual mailbox, in your own mailbox in Exchange. By the way, also interesting to know, Microsoft Teams works when you have a hybrid Exchange environment. In fact, if you have Exchange 2016 or higher on premises, I think the real version prerequisite is cumulative update 2 or 3 in Exchange 2016. Then you can also tie in your agenda and etc. And you can use Teams in the cloud and still have your mailbox on-prem. But a shadow mailbox will be created in Exchange Online for you as well. So you will have a shadow mailbox in Exchange Online, and whenever your mailbox from Exchange 2016 is going to be moved to Exchange Online, then those two mailboxes will be merged. And my apologies, I have to take a sip of water. All right, recordings. I think we all know that when you record a meeting, that it's going to be stored in Microsoft Stream. But what a lot of people don't know is that in the maximum of 24 hours before it's being moved to Stream, that particular recording is stored in Azure. It's using a blob storage. And why is that? Because Stream transcodes the recording into different bit rates and different encoders to optimize for different scenarios and different clients and different bandwidth that you have available to watch that recording back from. So the meeting is recorded, and actually when you start a recording, what happens is that a bot user is added to your meeting, and that bot user will trigger the recording. The recording will be stored in Azure blob storage, and usually it takes only a couple of minutes or maybe 10 minutes or maybe up to 1 hour, depending on how long the meeting was. And then you will get the notification that that recording is stored in Stream, and then it will be removed from the blob storage in Azure, but it can take up to 24 hours. Calendar meetings are stored in Exchange, contacts are stored in Exchange, and then there's telemetry, and we will talk a little bit more about telemetry as well later on when we talk about the compliance boundary of Microsoft Teams. But Microsoft is collecting a lot of telemetry. They really want to know how Teams is performing, how it is being used, which scenarios are being used, which functionality is being used the most. So they do gather a lot of telemetry from every Teams environment in the world. But what they don't do is gather customer content, and they anonymize the data before they pull it into their own warehouse. So there is no customer identifiable data in there. It's being stripped from everything, from your tenant information, from user information, etc. But there is telemetry data leaving your tenant going to Microsoft data warehouses. So the compliance boundary. When we talk about Microsoft Teams, of course, you can set up a compliance boundary around Microsoft Teams, and you can set up your DLP engines and retention policies and etc. And we'll talk a little bit more about those later on. But even if you do that, and even if you set that compliance boundary, you have to realize that there's a lot of interaction going on with Microsoft Teams, whether you like it or not. But some of these interactions you cannot prevent because they're just part of the service of Microsoft Teams. Some of those you can prevent. But you need to at least think about this, because there is data going hands and forth and from one service to another. For example, if you use connectors, you could hook up, I don't know, Twitter or Trello or any third-party service and let data from that service be posted in a Microsoft channel, in a Teams channel. When you use the email channel functionality, then data is posted in a channel as well. And what you have to realize there is that data, that email, is even going through a Microsoft service. It's not going directly to your Exchange environment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well. So that's incoming data from connectors and emails. When we talk about outgoing data, then we talk about jiffies. When you enter a jiffy, when you add a jiffy to a message, to a conversation, then a query will start to the Jiffy server, and I'm not sure how long Jiffy will be supported in Microsoft Teams now that Facebook has bought the Jiffy service, but we'll see. It's still a cool service, and I think a lot of people like the fact that you can make Teams a little bit more, I don't know, attractive by using the Jiffies. But you have to realize that an outgoing request is going to another service, namely the Jiffy service. And when we talk about push notifications, both Apple and Google have their own push notification service. So if Microsoft Teams sends a push notification to your Teams client on your mobile device, it will go through an Apple or Google service. There's a third-party cloud storage services, and by default, those are switched off, which is a good thing, I think. When Teams was just released and these third-party cloud storage services were also released, this was set on by default. So people could actually, members of a team could add a Dropbox or a Google Drive file storage to the files tab of that team. Nowadays, they're switched off by default, but maybe you are a company, maybe you are an organization that does use Box or Dropbox or any of the other services, then you can enable that service and add those services to the Files tab in Teams. Quite convenient if you use those services. But then again, you have to realize, hey, I'm getting content from another platform. And there's a couple more here. I won't go into much more detail, all of them, but use this slide if you want to think about, hey, where's my data going? What is Microsoft Teams communicating with which other services? Then I think this is a good slide, which by the way, I borrowed from Microsoft, where you can really see which services Microsoft Teams communicates with. All right, I already promised that we would talk a little bit about the Teams client architecture as well. And when Microsoft was thinking about that client architecture, they were really aiming to have as little code bases as possible, because it makes sense to have one single code base which you can use for the different platforms. And at least for the desktop, they do have this one single stack which uses TypeScript, all the jQuery, and a lot of other open source components. And when the Teams client was first released, it was all Angular, because back in the day, that was the platform that Microsoft had the most experience with. So they decided to build everything in Angular, and of course, a lot of HTML5 and CSS. And for the web, that is still being used. For the desktop, both in Windows and Mac, an Electron app is an Electron wrapper is around that code, and a little bit of C++ for Windows and a little bit of Objective-C for Mac is being used as well to make, especially for the meeting and calling functionality, and to make that work a little bit better and more responsive. Right now, Microsoft is using React within the Microsoft Corporation more and more, and they're using it in the SharePoint side of things as well, and also in the Teams client. They are now moving away from Angular, and they're transforming a lot of components into React. Not everything has been transformed yet. It's still work in progress, but a lot of it has been transformed already. All right. When you have a look at the browsers, all the latest browsers are supported, and the desktops as well. And then there's an interesting thing here, auto updates. The Teams client automatically updates itself. You don't have any influence on that from an admin perspective. And that's a little bit different than maybe what we're used to. Because with the Office client, with the other Office clients, Word and Excel and PowerPoint, sorry. It's the hay fever here. So with the other clients, we were used to back in the days to the admins would decide the pace on which we would roll out updates to the clients of the client machines of the users in our organization. Now we have the Office Pro Plus. So Microsoft is basically pushing the updates every month if you're on a monthly channel, but you still have the option to go to a bi-yearly channel, and you can say, okay, I only want the updates once every half year, once every 6 months. So you can kind of prepare and check if they work on your environment, etc. With the Teams client, that is not possible. The Teams client auto updates itself, and Microsoft decides when a new release is being pushed out. The only exception is when you roll out the Teams client on a virtual desktop infrastructure like Citrix or VMware Horizon or something like that, or Microsoft services. So then you have to install the Teams client with a special parameter, with a special setup parameter. It's the same client installation, but you cannot just run the client installation. You have to parameterize the setup, and then a special virtual desktop infrastructure client will be installed, which uses offloading of the audio and video to the client, to the thin client that is connecting to the virtual desktop. That particular client does not auto update. So Microsoft's still looking if they're going to also auto update that client, but right now that's not the case yet. So if you are running that environment and if you did install the client there, you have to kind of create a process for yourself around this, that you need to manually update the client from time to time to make sure you have the latest client running. Membership and roles. What you have to realize here is that a team owner can always do everything that is here in this table. So a team owner can always, for example, leave a team, but they can always, that's maybe not the most interesting one, but they can always delete a team. They can always add channels. They can always edit messages, etc. The only thing that you can restrict is that they can maybe not delete messages, but everything else they can do. For team members and for guest members, it's a different story. By default, they can do quite a lot. The team members can add channels, they can delete channels, etc. But as a team owner, you can decide on a per team level if a member is allowed to do that or not. And the same for guests. And by default, for guests, most things are switched off actually. So guests by default cannot add channels or delete channels. But if you would like guests to be able to do that, you can switch that on for them. So this is kind of interesting to see, hey, what can my members do? And this is something that you should probably also bring into the training of team owners, because then they can decide what they want their members to be able to do or not. There are quite a couple of admin roles available. And the Teams Service Administrator is the oldest one. That's the one that has been available almost from the beginning. And that's like the overall Teams admin. So it's basically the same as the SharePoint admin and the Exchange admin. So you can assign the admin to a person, and that person can then do everything that's related to the Teams service. The three Teams administrator roles underneath, the communication administrator, the support engineer, and the support specialist, are focused more on meetings and calling functionality. So if you are a heavy user, if your organization really uses meetings and callings, and maybe you also have calling plan infrastructure or direct routing set up or PSTN connections, etc., then these are specific roles that you can give to people, or maybe in the support organization, so they can troubleshoot things when it comes to calling and meetings. The last one, the group administrator, that's a relatively new one. It was announced at Ignite last year, so that was November, I think. So that's not that administrator role doesn't exist that long yet, but it's a nice one. I think it's very convenient. So now there is an administrator role, and people who are a member of this role, they can create and manage groups. And manage the settings like the naming, expiration policies, etc. And that's quite convenient because, as we just explained, the Office 365 group, or I still have to get used to the new name, the Microsoft 365 groups, yeah, they are the underlying construct of Teams as well. So it makes sense to have a separate administrator role for people who can manage these groups. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and have a look at settings. There are a lot of settings that you can set on the tenant level, and most of these settings go through policies. So you can create different policies for different groups of people. And there are message policies, there's a general Teams policy, there are calling and meeting policies. So there are different kinds of policies, and you can use these policies to assign these settings to groups of people. My recommendation in general is to be as little restrictive as possible on the tenant level. Why? Because you can always be more restrictive on a Teams level. And it makes sense, even though you maybe don't want to allow jiffies on the corporate team where all your organization members, all your co-workers and colleagues are a member of. Maybe you want to disable jiffies for that particular team. But other teams, maybe where conversations are a little bit less formal, where people have some more chats, when there are conversations about knowledge sharing, or maybe even joint interest or interest groups, etc., where you can create teams for as well. Maybe you want to allow jiffies there, but if you disable jiffies here on a tenant level, you cannot enable it again on a team level. So it's always the top level, the tenant level, that overrides the setting at the team level. That's something you need to keep in mind. So try to be as open as possible on the tenant level, and then you can always restrict it more on a team level. There's a couple of interesting things here. Maybe, so we already talked about jiffies, but maybe here you want to set that owners cannot delete send messages, and they cannot delete their own messages or other messages. So this is something that you can switch off here. I haven't seen that much in organizations yet, but it is something that you can think about. But you could also create a policy just for certain people where owners are not allowed to do that, or where users are not allowed to delete messages or edit send messages. What I see quite often is that guest users, for example, get their own policy, and these guest users, the external users, have less options. Maybe they are not able to delete their own message or to edit their own message. So that is something you could set up here. This is the email integration and the files integration that we talked about before as well. And I already told you that when you enable the email integration on a channel, then the people can send emails to the channel, and the email will end up as a new conversation in that channel. But that email will be routed through a Microsoft service. It will not be emailed directly to your Exchange Online environment and then picked up from there. You can see that by the email address that is being created. If you enable the email integration on a channel, you will see the email address that you can use to send the email to, and you can see that the domain name of that email address is not your own domain name. It's a Microsoft domain name. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something you need to keep in mind. So when people send email to that email address, that email will go through a separate service. The service is located in your region. So if you have your Teams environment in the European data region, or somewhere in the US or Australia, then the email will go through that region as well. But it is something you need to keep in mind. And what you can also do is, when you enable this service, you can at least restrict the domains from which you accept that email. So it makes sense to at least write down the domain name of your own email domain here, so that at least the people inside your company can send emails to channels in Microsoft Teams. And maybe you would like to add some domain names from specific vendors or partners that you work together with here as well. And if you do that, then at least you restrict random people to be able to send emails. Maybe sometime a screenshot is leaked or an email address for a channel is leaked in another way, and you don't want to be spammed. So here you can set up the email domains from which you want to accept those emails. And this is a rather new feature as well. I think it's available for, I don't know, maybe half a year or so, maybe a little bit longer. But I like this because when you invite external users into your Teams environment, and we will talk about external guest access a little bit later, but if you do that, then they will get a standard Microsoft invitation. And it looks as if Microsoft is inviting them to their Teams environment. But maybe you want to make sure, hey, no, it's not Microsoft, it's me, Contoso inviting you as an external user. So here you can set up a logo URL, a footer, a help URL, etc. So you can kind of customize the email and make it look more like as if it comes from your organization instead of Microsoft. So I like this feature. And then here you have the Teams policy, and I already talked about different policies: the Teams policy, the messaging policy, the meeting policy, etc. The two options that you have in the Teams policy right now, it's just these two options: it's discover private teams, and if you want to allow create private channels. If you enable the discovery of private teams here, then you can still set on a per team level if that team is allowed to be discovered or not. So you can still do that, but by default, all the private teams are discoverable. And if you enable this feature, make sure that you tell people that maybe they should not call a team maybe something as, I don't know, reorganization 2020 or layoffs 2021 or something, because people cannot see the content inside that team, but they can see the title of the team. It is discoverable. And with the create private channel options, here you can enable or disable the creation of private channels, but you could also create maybe a second Teams policy for a group of people, disable the private channels in one policy and enable it in another policy. And with that, if you do that, then only the group of people with that one policy can create private channels. So maybe you want to restrict creating private channels to a certain group of people. This is where you can do that. Then there's a lot of settings on the team level as well. And basically, a lot of these settings are the same as we noticed on the tenant level. So that's what I meant. If you set a setting on the tenant level, you can always be more restrictive on the team level. A couple of things here that we don't have on the tenant level is the tags, for example. And that's a relative new feature as well. And I like it. You can now create tags inside a team, and you can assign users to a tag, and then you can add mention that tag. So maybe you have, I don't know, a global team for your entire organization, but you want to be able to add mention a sales team, but there is no security group for that sales. There's no channel inside your team to add mention that sales group. Then you can create a tag, assign people to that tag, and then you can add mention the tag. And then the people who you have assigned to that tag will get a notification in their notification center. And here you can also see when a team will expire. We will talk more about that later on as well. There's a lot of member permissions that we talked about when I showed you the table with all the member permissions. Here you can set those up. And this is also a nice feature. This is the team code feature. If you go to team settings and you go to team code, you can generate a code and then show this code on a screen or in a presentation. And people can then type in this code and automatically become a member of a team. This works really well, for example, when you do trainings or presentations for maybe your champions program, your ambassador program. You did a training, and then at the end of the training, you tell the people, okay, now that we've done this training, I would really like you to join our ambassador community. It's a private team because I don't want anyone just to be able to join that team. But here is a code. If you type in this code, you can join the team automatically. That's a really cool feature. And finally, we have settings on the channel level. And here you can set up the channel moderation. And this is also something I like. because this makes it possible to only allow a group of people to start a new post or even reply to a message on that post. So this is very useful if you maybe have a channel where you want your corporate communication to be able to post messages and you don't want any other messages to end up there. So you can then enable the corporate communication people as the moderator of that channel, and then only they are allowed to post new messages in that channel. When you want to manage Teams with PowerShel, that is possible. You have to install a module called Microsoft Teams, very conveniently. And if you then install the module, well, then you can leverage a lot of commandlets that are available. For example, the get team one or the set team. So this is commandlets that you can use in automation. If you want to build maybe a custom provisioning process for Microsoft Teams, you can leverage these commandlets to maybe set some, I don't know, the visibility, the discoverability, or if you want to allow jiffies or not. Those types of things you can configure with the Teams PowerShel commandlets. If you want to restrict Teams creation, because by default, everyone in your organization can create a team, you can restrict it, but you have to restrict it on the Microsoft 365 group level. And you have to be careful, because if you do that, you're not only restricting creation of teams, you're also restricting creation of planner, planner plans, groups in CRM, groups in Power BI, to share reports, etc. Everywhere where Microsoft 365 groups are used, you're restricting the creation of these groups. So be careful when you use this. If you want to do it, this is how you do it. And you can add a security group here, so then only the people that are a member of the security group can create new groups. External guest access. Yeah, I promised that we would talk about this as well. By default, this is switched off for tenants, but on for all the teams that you are creating inside your tenant. And why is this important to realize? Because if you have created maybe, I don't know, 100 teams already, and then you decide to switch on guest access for your organization, then all the teams that were already created are able to invite guest users to these teams. And maybe there are teams, I don't know, for special secret projects or for legal department or for an HR department. There are teams where you want to be absolutely sure that guest users are not allowed inside that team. Then you have to switch off the external guest access for that particular team. And you have to do that through PowerShel. There is no UI option to disable guest access for a particular team. And here are the commandlets how to do that. And I will share my slide deck on Twitter later on, and I think they will be shared through the conference as well. But this is the commandlets, the script that you can use to disable external guest access for a particular team. There's a new option now, it's still in preview, and you can also use sensitivity labels to allow external user access or not. So you can create a sensitivity label in the Compliance Center, and you can go to the site and group settings of that sensitivity label, enable it. And then when you create a new team or a new SharePoint site for that matter, you will get an option to select a sensitivity label. And you can create, for example, 2 sensitivity labels, maybe one called internal and one called external. And then based on the sensitivity label that people choose, automatically you can decide if external guest user access should be switched on or should be switched off. So I really like this feature as well. All right, I wanted to go into a demo, but I only have 6 minutes left, I think. So I don't want to do too much demo because there's a couple more things that I want to show. And the last demo that I really want to do is about the Microsoft Graph. So let's move on. Groups expiration policy, also something you can enable for your Teams environment. But again, this connects to Microsoft 365 groups and not necessarily to just a team. Also, this is a feature that only works, that is only available if you have Azure Active Directory Premium licenses assigned to your users. So be aware of that. But when you have that, you can set up an expiration policy which automatically expires a team, for example, after 90 days if it's not being used. By default, it will track usage of a team. So every time a team is visited or something is posted in a channel or a file is accessed in SharePoint, then the counter will be reset, and the 90 days, or in this case 90 days, you can also type in 180 days or 365 days. The counter will be reset and it will start counting again. So this is what you can use if a team is not being used anymore. Then after 90 days, the team will be automatically expired. There's a way to set up naming conventions inside Microsoft Teams, and you can do that through PowerShel again. So you can set up a fixed prefix. So in this case, for example, I would like every team that's being created to start with GRP group and then underscore, and then we'll take the department parameter from the user profile of the person creating the team, and then we'll take the group name. That's the name that a person typed in as the name of the team when he or she would like to request a new team. So this is kind of dynamic because you can use properties from the user profile of people into the naming convention of your team. If you would like more flexible options, then you would have to create your own provisioning mechanism, and you can do that through PowerShel or in a combination with Azure Functions maybe, or Power Automate. There are multiple options, or there are even provisioning engines out there. You can also set up custom blocked words list, and I also included the commandlet how you can then enable this for your environment. Quite recently, a couple of months ago, Microsoft brought all these options to the UI as well. So right into the Azure AD portal. So you have to go to portal.azure.com and then go to Azure Active Directory. This is also where you can set up that expiration policy that we just talked about. This is also now the place where you can set up the group naming policy. Then there's retention policies. So you can create retention policies in the Compliance Center of Office 365. And these retention policies were already available for SharePoint and Exchange and OneDrive, and they're available for Teams now as well. And you can enable a policy either for channel messages or for chat messages or for both. And you can also include certain teams or include all teams or exclude a couple of teams or users. The funny thing is you cannot create one policy that is being applied automatically to both SharePoint and Teams. And that would make sense, I guess, because as you know, files inside a team are actually stored in SharePoint. So if I have a retention policy for channel messages, maybe I would like to have that same policy being applied to the files that reside in that channel. And that's in SharePoint. So you would then have to create a second retention policy with the same parameters, with the same retention settings, but then apply it to SharePoint. So you have to create one for Teams and one for SharePoint. And the same for chats. You have to create one for chats and one for OneDrive. There's the option to archive teams. You can go to the Teams settings and then archive a team. What it does, it doesn't really archive the team. It only makes the team read-only. And remember, all the members are still a member of that team. They can still go to that team, but they will not be able to add new messages, start new conversations, or add new files. Everything will be in read-only. Also, keep in mind that the expiration policy is still applicable to this site. So if you archive a team and no one is using that team anymore, then and when the expiration policy, when the amount of days is reached, let's say 90 days again, then the team will be automatically deleted. The good thing is you will get a warning up front, 30 days up front, 15 days up front, and 1 day up front before the team is actually deleted. And then there's the Graph API. The Graph API is very useful to provision teams or create channels in Teams. And now you can also create messages in Teams. And that's something I particularly like because now if you build your own Teams provisioning engine, you could maybe also add a welcoming message inside that teams already, inside that team. So you create a team, you create the channels required for that particular team. Maybe it's around a project, and then you can also create a welcoming message with maybe a link to a library with content that you want to share inside that team. So I really like that. And that's something that I would like to show you in a demo. So here I have the Graph Explorer, and I pre-created some URLs. So, oops. This URL will get me all the messages inside a channel. So I already figured out the team ID. I already figured out the channel ID. So now I can use this. Let's go back to my browser. Ooh, my mouse not working. Okay. I can post that here and I can run the query. And here in the response, I will get the messages in my team. And here I have one message, welcome to my Graph API demo. And if I go to my team and I have my Graph channel here, you can indeed see that I have one message here. Yeah, I got it. I have one message here, welcome to my Graph API demo. Now I'm going to run a second URL, and here I'm going to post something. Back to the Graph Explorer. Here, and now I'm not going to do a get but a post, and I have a little bit of content prepared here. Back to the browser, I go to the body, and now when I run that query, all right, this seems to have worked. And now when I go back here, you see this message here, you're an awesome audience. So it added a message to an existing message in Teams, and you can of course create a new message in here as well. All right, back to my slides. That was it. This was a really high-paced session because I really wanted to cover all the topics in the 15 minutes that I had. I would like to point out that you can join the raffle, of course, visit the vendor booth, submit your answers, and you need at least 5 correct answers, but then you will have the chance to win an Oculus Quest. And of course, consider donating to the following charity relief funds. If you have any money to spare, please do donate to these very good charity causes. And then finally, don't forget to give feedback. Of course, event feedback, but particularly for me, speaker feedback. I'm very interested to know if you like the sessions, what I could improve, what I can do better. Even if you did like it, please rate it as well. Don't just rate it when you didn't like it. And please do realize that I have a family. Anyway, thanks very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of the conference.